Under the burning Arizona sun, the air was dry and heavy with dust. Cowboys had just finished a long cattle drive, and the small wooden trading post at the edge of town stood as the only place where men could buy food, drink, or a bed for the night. Luke, a tall cowboy with a weather-worn hat and tired boots, tied up his horse outside the post and walked in slowly. His face showed the exhaustion of days spent under the open sky, pushing cattle across rough land. His money was nearly gone, but he still hoped to buy a drink of water and maybe a small meal. Inside, the trading post was noisy. The room smelled of whiskey, sweat, and dust from the road. A group of men sat at a rough table laughing loudly, their glasses filled with cheap liquor. The old trader behind the counter counted coins, his hands moving with practiced speed. The shelves around him held sacks of flour, beans, wheat, and tools needed for life on the frontier. Luke's eyes scanned the room, but what caught his attention was not the whiskey or the goods for sale. It was the sight of a young Apache woman sitting in the far corner. She sat quietly, her back against the wall, her dark eyes lowered to the floor. Her clothes were worn, her hair tied loosely, and her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked neither angry nor defeated, but her stillness spoke of something heavy. Around her, the voices of the men grew louder. One of them lifted his glass and bragged loudly, "2 drinks and a sack of wheat, that's all she cost me." The men roared with laughter, clinking their glasses together. Luke froze, his jaw tightening. He could not believe what he had just heard. The trader chuckled and added, "Better deal than most, if you ask me. Times are hard, and folks will trade anything for food." The men nodded as if it was nothing unusual, but Luke felt a cold unease in his chest. He had seen cruelty before on the frontier, but this, trading a human being for drinks and grain, was different. His gaze went back to the woman. She did not raise her eyes, but Luke could feel the quiet strength she carried even in silence. He walked closer to the counter and asked in a low voice, "What's the story with her?" The trader shrugged. "She was left here. Man came in hungry, wanted wheat and whiskey, said he couldn't feed her anymore. So here she sits." The casual way he said it, as if she were just another sack of grain, made Luke's stomach twist. Luke was not a rich man. He had no large ranch, no pile of gold coins. All he owned was his small place outside town, a few cattle, and the pride that came from working honestly. But as he looked at the woman, he felt something stir inside him, anger at the men who laughed, sorrow for her situation, and a sudden sense of responsibility. He could not just walk away. One of the men noticed Luke's stare and sneered. "Careful, cowboy. Don't go getting ideas. She ain't worth much trouble." Another man added with a grin, "Unless you've got another sack of wheat to spare." Their laughter filled the room again, but Luke didn't laugh. He tipped his hat down and walked straight toward the trader. "I'll take her with me," Luke said firmly. The laughter died for a moment, replaced by silence. The trader raised an eyebrow. "Take her? And what will you pay with? You don't look like a man with much to spare." Luke reached into his pocket and placed his last few coins on the counter. "This is all I have. Enough to pay for food and a roof over her head. That's more than 2 drinks can give her." The trader hesitated, looking at the coins. They weren't much, but he also knew Luke's reputation. Luke was honest and hard-working, not a man to cause trouble. Finally, the trader nodded. "Fine, she's yours to deal with now. But don't come back crying if this brings you trouble." Luke turned toward the woman. She lifted her eyes at last, meeting his for the first time. Her gaze was steady, almost questioning, as if she was trying to see what kind of man he really was. He extended his hand, not to pull her, but to invite her. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly she stood, her steps careful, her shoulders straight. She placed her hand in his, and together they walked out of the trading post. The men at the table started laughing again, their voices mocking. "Cowboy's gone soft," one of them shouted. Another called, "2 drinks and wheat, what a bargain for your woman." Luke ignored them. He did not look back. Outside, the bright sun burned down on the dirt road, and the horses pawed at the ground impatiently. Luke untied his horse and helped the woman climb up carefully. She moved with quiet grace, holding on to the saddle as he mounted in front of her. As they rode away, dust rising behind them, Luke could feel the weight of his choice. He knew the whispers in town would not be kind. He knew there would be questions from the Apache people too. But in that moment, all that mattered was that the woman was no longer sitting in the corner of a trading post, treated as something less than human. She was leaving with dignity, and Luke silently promised himself he would protect that dignity. The journey back to his small ranch was long and quiet. The woman spoke no words, only looking out at the wide desert stretching to the horizon. Luke respected her silence. He did not ask questions or push her to speak. Instead, he let the steady rhythm of the horse's steps carry them forward. When they finally reached his ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Luke dismounted and helped her down gently. "This is home," he said simply, gesturing toward the modest cabin, the corral, and the few cattle grazing nearby. She studied the place carefully, her eyes sharp. He led her inside, where the wooden walls held the warmth of a simple life. One bed, a table, a stove, and shelves lined with tools. He gave her water first, then offered bread and beans from a pot he had left on the stove. She ate slowly, politely, her eyes never leaving his face. As the evening settled in, Luke sat quietly at the table, turning his hat in his hands. He wondered what her name was, where she had come from, and what her life had been before that cruel trade. He didn't know how to bridge the silence between them, but he trusted that in time, respect and kindness would build the bridge. That night, as the desert winds howled softly outside, Luke lay awake on the floor, leaving the bed for her. His thoughts circled again and again around the same truth. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat had been the price placed on her by others. But to him, her worth could never be measured by coins, grain, or whiskey. He knew that life was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. The next morning, the Arizona sun rose bright and golden, spreading its light across the quiet ranch. Luke was already awake, tending to the horses in the corral. His movements were slow but steady, the way of a man used to working alone. But now things were different. As he leaned against the fence, he noticed the woman stepping outside the cabin. She walked carefully, her bare feet touching the cool earth, her eyes scanning the wide open land as if she were studying every tree, every hill, every bird in the sky. Luke paused and tipped his hat politely. He did not want to frighten her. "Morning," he said in a gentle voice. She did not answer, but gave him a small nod, acknowledging his words. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of questions, unspoken fears, and the slow beginnings of trust. Inside the cabin, Luke had left bread and water on the table, hoping she would feel free to eat whenever she wished. When she stepped back in, she sat down, picked up the bread, and ate with slow, careful bites. Luke stayed outside a while longer, giving her space. He had no idea what her thoughts were, but he sensed she was not a woman to be pitied. There was strength in the way she held herself, even in this strange place. Later, Luke returned to the cabin and sat at the table across from her. He pointed to his chest and said, "Luke." Then he waited. For a moment, she only looked at him. Then, in a soft but clear voice, she said, "Ayanna." It was the first word she had spoken to him, and the sound of it carried weight, like a name with deep roots in her people's history. Luke repeated it quietly, careful not to mispronounce it. "Ayanna." She gave a faint nod, and for the first time a small flicker of trust passed between them. Days slowly turned into weeks. Luke did not force conversation, but he found ways to make life more comfortable for her. He showed her where he kept the water, how the stove worked, and which corner of the cabin she could call her own. In return, Ayanna began helping around the ranch without being asked. She fetched water from the well, tended the small fire, and one afternoon Luke found her calmly brushing down one of his horses, her hands moving with practiced skill. He watched in quiet amazement. The horse, usually stubborn, stood still under her touch, as if it trusted her completely. Luke smiled faintly. "You've got away with them," he said softly, though he doubted she understood every word. But Ayanna looked up briefly and gave him the smallest of smiles before turning back to the horse. In town, however, things were not so peaceful. Word had spread about what had happened at the trading post. People whispered that Luke had taken an Apache woman home. Some said he was foolish, others said he was brave, and a few warned that it would bring trouble. Whenever Luke rode into town for supplies, he could feel the stares following him. Men muttered behind his back, and women pulled their children aside when Ayanna's name was spoken. But Luke kept his head down and went about his business. He didn't owe anyone an explanation. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ayanna began to hum softly. The tune was unfamiliar to Luke, but it was soothing, filled with echoes of her people's traditions. He listened in silence, feeling the song wrap around the small cabin like a blanket. When she noticed him watching, she stopped, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It's beautiful," Luke said gently, though he knew she might not catch every word. Still, he wanted her to know he respected her voice. Little by little, Ayanna shared pieces of her story. With broken English and gestures, she explained how her family had struggled through hard seasons. The rivers had dried, the land had grown thin, and hunger had forced desperate choices. She spoke of her brother who had left to hunt but never returned, and of the man who had traded her away in exchange for food. Her eyes shone with pain, but she did not weep. Instead, she spoke with quiet strength, as though each word was a stone being placed carefully on the ground, building a path between her and Luke. Luke listened with deep respect, never interrupting, never judging. He realized then that her presence in his home was not just about kindness or rescue. It was about dignity. It was about giving her space to stand again as her own person, not as a bargain made in a dusty trading post. As the weeks rolled by, Ayanna began to adapt to life on the ranch. She learned a few more English words from Luke, and Luke learned a few Apache words from her. Together, they found ways to communicate, through gestures, through work, through the simple rhythm of daily life. When Luke fixed the fence, she handed him nails and held the boards steady. When she cooked a meal, he chopped wood for the fire. Slowly, their lives began to weave together like threads in a single cloth. But even as peace settled between them, trouble brewed beyond the ranch. Some townsmen began to say Luke had no right to keep her. "He's got himself an Apache woman," one man sneered at the saloon. "Mark my words, that'll bring Apache raiders down on us." Others laughed, calling Luke soft-hearted. And a few, in hushed tones, admitted they envied him, not because of cruelty, but because they saw how Ayanna carried herself with quiet pride, something rare in such hard times. Luke ignored the talk, but he knew the danger was real. Life on the frontier was never simple, and prejudice ran deep. He often lay awake at night, listening to the wind against the wooden walls, wondering how long he could protect Ayanna from both gossip in town and the anger of her people. One morning, while Luke was repairing the corral, Ayanna appeared with a bundle of herbs in her hands. She knelt beside a horse with a small wound on its leg and began applying the herbs gently. Luke crouched beside her, curious. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. She looked up at him, her eyes calm, and said one word: "Mother." Luke nodded slowly, realizing she carried the wisdom of generations in her hands. The horse stood quietly as she worked, and Luke felt a deep respect for her knowledge. That evening, as they sat outside watching the sun set behind the hills, Luke spoke slowly. "This land is hard, but maybe we can make it kinder." Ayanna turned her face toward him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. She did not answer, but the silence between them felt less heavy now, almost like an agreement. For Luke, every passing day confirmed what he had felt that first moment in the trading post. She was not someone to be pitied, not someone to be treated as less. She was Ayanna, strong, capable, and deserving of the same respect as any man or woman. And though he did not yet know what their future held, he was certain of one thing. The choice he had made was the right one, no matter what others said. Would you like me to now expand Part 3 into 1,300 words in the same flowing style? The days on the ranch moved slowly, guided by the rising and setting of the sun. Life for Luke had always been simple: work from dawn until dusk, eat a meal by the fire, and sleep under the sound of the desert wind. But now, with Ayanna there, the rhythm felt different. The silence of the house was no longer empty. The footsteps across the wooden floor, the soft sounds of her humming, and the quiet way she moved around the ranch gave a new sense of life to the place. At first, Luke thought she might remain distant, but he soon realized Ayanna was learning everything she could about his way of life. She watched him carefully, studied how he worked, and when she felt ready, she began helping without being asked. She carried buckets of water from the well, gathered firewood from the edge of the property, and even fixed torn leather straps with nimble fingers. Her presence turned the lonely cabin into something closer to a home. Luke noticed her sharp eyes and steady hands. She had grown up with knowledge he didn't have. She could track small movements in the dirt, notice changes in the sky that warned of weather, and prepare herbs to ease pain or heal small wounds. One afternoon, when a calf injured its leg on a broken fence post, Luke expected it would limp for weeks. But Ayanna crushed herbs into a paste, wrapped the wound with cloth, and by the next day the calf stood more firmly than before. Luke watched with quiet admiration. "You're good with them," he said. She didn't answer with words, only gave him a short nod. Their bond grew not through talk but through action. They worked side by side, learning to read each other's movements. Luke would lift a heavy sack and Ayanna would already be holding the door open. She would set a pot on the stove, and he would have firewood ready. Slowly, without needing to speak much, they began to understand each other's rhythm. But beyond the ranch, voices were rising. The town was restless. People had noticed Luke no longer came alone to trade. Some had seen Ayanna with him, her dark hair and quiet presence impossible to hide. Whispered words floated through the saloon and the marketplace. "He's keeping her," one man muttered. Another shook his head. "It'll bring trouble. You mark my words, the Apaches will come for her." Others laughed cruelly, saying Luke had paid nothing more than scraps for her, calling her a bargain. Luke heard these whispers whenever he rode into town. He kept his head down, ignoring the sharp stares, but inside he felt the weight of them. He didn't care about insults to himself, he had weathered worse in his life. But he worried what would happen if anger spread. People feared what they didn't understand, and fear often led to violence. At night, sitting by the fire, Luke sometimes caught himself wondering if he had done the right thing. Not because he doubted Ayanna's worth, he knew in his heart that her life was priceless, but because he questioned whether he had the strength to shield her from the world outside his ranch. He didn't want to be another man who made decisions for her. He wanted her to feel free. Ayanna seemed to sense his unease. One evening, as he sat quietly polishing his boots, she spoke slowly in her soft English. "You think too much." Her voice was steady, and for the first time her eyes carried a spark of humor. Luke chuckled lightly. "Maybe I do." It was a small moment, but it showed him that she was not only surviving, she was beginning to live again. As weeks passed, their days blended into something resembling peace. But trouble was never far. One afternoon, as Luke was mending a fence, he spotted riders on the horizon. 3 men from town approached, their hats low and their eyes sharp. They dismounted near the corral and walked toward him. "Evening, Luke," one of them said, his tone casual but his eyes unfriendly. "Heard you've got yourself an Apache woman out here." Luke's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "She's got a name, Ayanna," the man sneered. "Don't matter what her name is. Folks are saying you stole her, that she don't belong here." Luke stood tall, meeting their eyes. "I didn't steal her. I gave her a home when she was left with nothing. She stays because she chooses to." The men exchanged looks. One spat on the ground. "Choice? Don't be foolish, Luke. This'll only bring trouble. You'd best think on that." Without waiting for an answer, they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving behind the echo of their warning. That night, Luke sat by the fire, turning their words over in his mind. He worried for Ayanna's safety, but when he looked at her across the room, he saw no fear. She was calm, her hands weaving a piece of cloth she had begun working on. For her, fear was not new. She had lived through harder trials. Luke realized then that the strength she carried was not something fragile. It was rooted deep. The next morning, Ayanna surprised him. She walked to the corral, picked up a rope, and with swift movements began guiding one of the horses as if she had been training animals all her life. Luke watched in silence as the horse followed her lead, its ears twitching at her soft voice. When she finally let go, she turned to him with a look that said without words, "I am not weak. I am not helpless." Luke nodded slowly, his respect for her growing each day. Yet he could not ignore the storm brewing outside. Rumors traveled fast, and not all of them came from the settlers. Whispers reached him that Ayanna's people too had heard where she was. Some said her brother was looking for her, gathering others to confront the man who had taken her. Luke knew the day would come when he could no longer stand between the two worlds. He cared for Ayanna, but he also knew she had family, a history, and a voice that needed to be heard. What frightened him most was not losing her. It was that others, blinded by anger or pride, might try to take her freedom away again. One evening, as the desert sky turned shades of purple and gold, Luke and Ayanna sat outside watching the horizon. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Luke said quietly, "If you wish to return to your people, I won't stop you." Ayanna looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she shook her head slowly. "Not yet," she said. Her words were simple, but they carried meaning. She was choosing for now to stay. Luke felt a wave of relief mixed with the weight of responsibility. He knew her choice would not end the danger, but it gave him strength. Whatever lay ahead, whispers in town, confrontations with her people, or the tests of living on the frontier, he would face it, as long as she had the freedom to decide her own path. As night fell and the stars appeared over the desert, Luke lay awake once more. He thought about the strange path his life had taken. A woman once traded for 2 drinks and a sack of wheat now stood beside him, teaching him about strength, patience, and dignity. The price others had placed on her was meaningless. What she carried within her was beyond measure. And though the future was uncertain, Luke felt something he had not felt in years: hope. The desert evening was calm, the air cooling after a long, hot day. The sun had dipped low, leaving streaks of red and gold across the horizon. Luke was mending a gate near the corral when he heard the sound of distant hoofbeats. At first he thought it was travelers passing along the trail, but as the sound grew louder, he realized the riders were coming straight toward his ranch. He dropped the hammer in his hand and stood tall, his heart tightening with unease. 3 riders appeared, their horses moving with quiet power. They were Apache men, their faces strong, their eyes sharp. One of them carried a bow across his back, and another had a long spear resting against his shoulder. The man in front was slightly younger than Luke, but his posture carried authority. He rode with confidence, scanning the land until his gaze settled on the cabin. Luke did not need to ask who he was. Something in the way Ayanna suddenly froze by the water trough told him all he needed to know. The younger man dismounted first, his boots hitting the earth with a thud. He walked forward, his voice low but firm. "I am Kiona, her brother." His hand gestured toward Ayanna, who stood silently, her face calm but her eyes alert. Luke swallowed hard, then nodded respectfully. "I'm Luke," he said. His voice was steady, though his mind raced. He had expected this moment, but now that it was here, it felt heavier than he imagined. Kiona's eyes narrowed. "Why is she here? Why is my sister in your house?" The words carried suspicion, anger, and pain all at once. The 2 other warriors dismounted as well, their hands close to their weapons, though they did not draw them. Luke straightened his shoulders. "She was left at the trading post, traded for grain and whiskey. I could not leave her there." Kiona's jaw tightened. "And so you took her? Like the others take what is not theirs?" His voice rose slightly, and the 2 warriors at his side shifted, ready to defend him if needed. Before Luke could respond, Ayanna stepped forward. Her face remained calm, but her voice, when she spoke in her native tongue, was sharp and strong. Luke did not understand the words, but he could hear the firmness in her tone. She was not asking, she was declaring. Kiona listened, his eyes softening slightly as she spoke. The other warriors lowered their weapons slowly, though their faces still carried suspicion. Finally, Kiona turned back to Luke. "She says you did not take her. She says you gave her food, water, and respect. She says you gave her choice." Luke nodded once. "That is true. She stays because she wishes to. Not because I demand it." The air grew still. Kiona studied him carefully, as if weighing the truth of his words. After a long silence, he spoke again. "You must understand. She is our blood. We thought she was lost to us. We feared the worst. To see her here, alive, it is both relief and anger. Relief because she is safe. Anger because she was taken so easily." Luke lowered his voice. "I don't blame you for that anger. I've seen what men will do when they see hunger or weakness. But I promise you this, I never treated her as less. I never will." Ayanna spoke again in her language, her voice carrying across the open air. This time her words were longer, filled with emotion. Kiona's face changed as he listened. He looked at her, then at Luke, and finally nodded slowly. "She says she chooses to stay for now. She says it is her decision." The tension eased slightly, though the moment remained fragile. The 2 warriors stepped back, giving space. Kiona walked closer to his sister, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. They exchanged quiet words, and though Luke could not understand them, he saw the warmth between them. When Kiona turned back, his voice was softer. "You must know, Cowboy, this choice is not simple. Our people will question it. The settlers will question it. You will stand in the middle of fire from both sides." Luke gave a small nod. "I know, but I'll stand there if I have to." The 3 Apache men mounted their horses once more. Before leaving, Kiona spoke again. "We will return. We must speak as family. But for now, we leave her in your care. Treat her well, as you say." With that, they rode off into the fading light, their figures growing smaller against the desert horizon. When the sound of hoofbeats finally faded, Luke let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned toward Ayanna, who stood with her arms folded across her chest. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes glimmered with something unspoken. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude. That night, the cabin was quiet. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering light across the wooden walls. Luke sat at the table, turning the events over in his mind. "You stood strong today," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "You told them what you wanted." Ayanna looked at him, then nodded once. "My choice," she said simply. Her words carried a weight far greater than their sound. But while peace had been made on the ranch, trouble stirred in town. The men who had mocked Luke at the trading post had not forgotten him. They saw the visit of the Apache warriors as proof of their fears. "See?" one man growled at the saloon. "First she's traded, now they're coming here. If he keeps her, the whole town will pay the price when her people come riding in." Others muttered that Luke had broken the unwritten rules of frontier life. "A cowboy's job is to protect settlers, not bring danger to their doors," one declared. The whispers grew, slowly feeding into anger. A few days later, Luke rode into town for supplies. As he tied his horse outside the general store, he could feel the eyes on him. Inside, the store went quiet when he walked in. A group of men stood near the counter, their expressions hard. One of them spoke up, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you're clever, Luke, hiding her out there. But you're bringing trouble to all of us." Luke met his eyes calmly. "She isn't trouble. She's a person. She deserves respect, same as you or me." The man snorted. "Respect? She's an Apache. You think they'll respect us when they come riding in? You've made your choice, Luke, but you've made it for all of us too." Luke carried his supplies to the counter, ignoring the stares. He knew arguing would only make things worse. But as he left the store, he realized the town would not let this rest. The whispers had grown into threats, and sooner or later someone would try to make him give her up. Back at the ranch, he told Ayanna what had happened. She listened quietly, her face steady. When he finished, she placed her hand on the table and said firmly, "Not leave. My choice." Luke looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. He knew she had faced hunger, loss, and betrayal. She would not bend easily now. Her strength gave him strength, but it also deepened his worry. He could stand against the town, but how long before anger turned into action? As the fire burned low that night, Luke made a silent promise. Whatever storm was coming, he would not back down. He had seen her worth, and he would not allow anyone to measure her life in drinks or wheat again. The morning sun rose over the Arizona desert, painting the land with gold and copper. Luke stood outside his cabin, leaning against the fence as he watched the cattle move lazily across the field. The air was still, but his mind was restless. The visit from Ayanna's brother had left him thinking, and the cold stares from town were still fresh in his memory. He knew a storm was coming, not from the sky but from people. Settlers who feared what they didn't understand. Inside the cabin, Ayanna prepared a small breakfast of beans and bread. She moved with quiet grace, her hands steady even when the world around her seemed uncertain. Luke stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. She glanced at him, her dark eyes calm, and set the plate on the table. For a while they ate in silence. Finally, Luke spoke, his voice low but firm. "The town won't stay quiet. They'll come here one day asking questions, maybe worse." Ayanna looked at him and said softly, "I know." Her English was still broken, but her meaning was clear. She was not afraid. Luke admired that strength, though it also worried him. Fear was what made people dangerous, and the town was full of it. That afternoon, Luke saddled his horse and rode into town to buy supplies. The moment he stepped into the trading post, the room went quiet. Men sitting at the table lowered their voices, and the trader behind the counter raised his eyebrows. Luke ignored them and placed his order. But before he could leave, one of the men from the saloon stepped forward. "Well, well," the man sneered. "Cowboy's still keeping that Apache woman at his place, eh? You think that makes you some kind of hero?" Luke's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone steady. "She has a name, Ayanna, and she stays because she chooses to." The man laughed harshly. "Choice, don't fool yourself. She don't belong here. You're making trouble for the whole town." Another voice joined in from the back. "That's right. When her people ride in, we'll all pay the price. And it'll be your fault, Luke. The room filled with mutters of agreement. Luke felt their anger pressing against him like a wave. He placed his coins on the counter, took his supplies, and turned toward the door. But before he could step out, the first man spat on the ground and shouted, "2 drinks and a sack of wheat. That's all she was worth, and that's all she'll ever be." Luke stopped cold. His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself not to turn back. Fighting would only feed their hatred. Instead, he opened the door, stepped into the bright sunlight, and mounted his horse. He rode out of town, his heart heavy, his mind filled with fire. When he returned to the ranch, Ayanna noticed his troubled face. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch steady. "They speak lies," she said simply. Luke nodded, though the words still echoed in his head. He wanted to believe their cruelty could not touch her, but he knew words had power. A few days later, the storm finally came. Luke was fixing the fence when a group of townsmen rode up to the ranch. Dust rose behind their horses, and their faces were hard with anger. Luke stood tall, wiping his hands on his trousers as they approached. The leader of the group, a broad man with a thick beard, called out, "Luke, we've had enough. We won't let you bring danger to our town. You've got to send her away." Luke's voice was calm but firm. "She isn't danger. She's a person. She's Ayanna, and she stays if she chooses." The men muttered among themselves, their voices sharp. "You're blind, Luke," one of them shouted. "When her people come for her, they won't care about your kindness. They'll come for all of us." Luke shook his head. "You're wrong. They came already. They spoke with her. They listened to her choice. She is not a prisoner. She is free," the bearded man scowled. "Free? She was traded for whiskey like a sack of grain. Don't talk to us about freedom." Before Luke could answer, the cabin door opened. Ayanna stepped outside, her head held high. She walked forward slowly until she stood beside Luke. Her presence silenced the men for a moment. With clear, steady eyes, she looked at them and spoke in her careful English. "I am Ayanna. I am not wheat, not drink, not trade. I am woman. I choose." The men shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, ashamed, while others grew angrier. The bearded man spat on the ground. "Words won't change what you are," he muttered. But his voice had lost some of its fire. Luke stepped forward, his voice strong. "Listen to me. You say she was worth 2 drinks and a sack of wheat. But that's a lie. No person's worth can be measured by grain or whiskey. Her life, her dignity, her choice, they are beyond price. You may laugh at me, mock me, call me foolish, but I'll stand by her because I know the truth." For a moment, silence hung in the air. The men shifted uneasily, their anger not as sharp as before. Finally, the bearded man turned his horse. "You'll regret this, Luke," he said, but his voice lacked certainty. One by one, the others followed, riding away and leaving only the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. When they were gone, Luke let out a long breath. Ayanna stood beside him, her shoulders straight, her eyes calm. "You spoke strong," she said quietly. Luke smiled faintly. "So did you." That night, the ranch was peaceful again. The stars shone brightly and the desert wind whispered through the grass. Ayanna sat by the fire, weaving a small cloth, while Luke watched her with quiet respect. He realized then that his life had changed forever. He had taken her home out of instinct, out of a sense of justice. But now he understood that she had given him something in return: strength, hope, and a reminder that dignity cannot be traded. Weeks later, Ayanna's brother returned with 2 other family members. This time, their faces were calmer. They spoke with her for a long time, and Luke waited outside, giving them privacy. When they finally stepped out, Kiona nodded at Luke. "She is safe here. She is strong. We see this now." Luke bowed his head slightly. "She is free to choose always. That is what matters." Ayanna smiled faintly, her eyes meeting Luke's. She chose once again to stay for a while longer. But whether she left one day or remained, Luke knew he would carry her memory with him forever. Years later, when people in town spoke of that summer, they remembered the cowboy who stood firm against laughter and scorn. They remembered the Apache woman who lifted her head and declared her worth. And they remembered the moment when 2 drinks and a sack of wheat, once spoken as a cruel joke, were turned into a lesson about dignity, courage, and respect. Luke never forgot. For the rest of his life, whenever he looked across the desert at the golden horizon, he remembered the woman who had taught him that no one's value could ever be measured in coin, grain, or whiskey. And in that memory he found peace.